We're going to look at Luke's account, Luke chapter 19. This particular account is found in all four of the Gospels, Jesus' triumphant entry. And it's interesting because as we're looking at these events that happened 2,000 years ago, I pray that we can put ourselves in the story. Because, guys, those events didn't happen just for that generation or for that time period. Those events happened so that you and I could be saved, so that you and I can have a relationship with God. And I pray you keep that in mind as we're going through these events, that, God did it because he loved us. Matter of fact, in Romans chapter 5, and I just consider this passage, Romans 5:6, it says this: "For when we were still without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man would one die. Perhaps for a good man, someone would even dare to die." Check this out. "But God demonstrated his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than having been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from what? From the wrath through him." That's the picture. God died for the ungodly. He died for the sinner like you and I. And he demonstrated his love for us by going to a cross. And that's where all of this leads to, and then him defeating the grave. And so we're gonna look at that. It's interesting that as we come to this account, we know that Jesus had been in Galilee. He had been making the journey from Galilee to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover feast. And I think it was for him, for the disciples, it was just, we're just going to go celebrate the Passover. For Jesus, it was fully aware that he was about to suffer the most heinous, cruel death a person could ever endure. The death of a cross, and Jesus aware of it. Matter of fact, in Matthew's account, now I'm not going to ask you to turn there, but in Matthew's account of these same events, in Matthew chapter 20, before they get into Jerusalem, Jesus pulls his disciples aside, and he says these words to them. It says in Matthew 20:17, "Now Jesus going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside on the road, and he said to them, 'Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. They'll deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify, and on the third day he will rise again.'" Guys, that's mind-boggling to me. Jesus told the whole scenario before they ever entered into Jerusalem. Jesus didn't walk into the trap, he set the trap. Jesus didn't go in there and go, "Oh no, what happened?" Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen. Matter of fact, the events of this Sunday prior to the resurrection is in mind. And what's incredible is that Jesus is now going to set everything in order on Palm Sunday, or what's known as the beginning of the Passion. And on Palm Sunday is what we're looking at here. Jesus is going to challenge the Roman rule by proclaiming himself to be the King of the Jews. And he knew that the moment he proclaimed he was the king, that Rome would have to act. But he didn't stop there. He challenged the authority of the religious leaders. And we'll see that in this passage. And it was going to cause both groups that were in power, the religious groups and the political groups, to either bow their knee or rebel against his claim. And so this events that we're looking at are significant in that it began the ball rolling and there was no turning back. Once this day happened, once this Sunday took place, there was no backing out. He just set everything in motion, and he knew that he had set everything in motion as a result of it. Now let's jump in Luke chapter 19, verse 28, and let's read the account together. And when he had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. And it came to pass, when he drew near to Bethphage and Bethany at the mountain called Olivet, that he sent two of his disciples, saying, "Go into the village opposite you. Whereas you enter, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Loose it and bring it here. And if anyone asks you, 'Why are you loosing it?' thus you shall say to him, 'Because the Lord has need of it.'" So those who were sent went their way and found it just as he had said it to them. And as they were loosing the colt, the owner of it, he said, "Why are you loosing the colt?" And they said, "The Lord has need of him." And when they brought him to Jesus, they threw their own clothes on the colt, and they sat Jesus on him. And as he went, many spread their clothes on the road. Then, as he was now drawing near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice and to praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works which they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees called to him from the crowd, "Jesus, rebuke your disciples." And Jesus answered and he said to them, "I tell you that if these should keep silent, these stones would immediately cry out." As he drew near, he saw the city and he wept over it, saying, "If you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation." Interesting passage. Jesus now entering into Jerusalem. He's coming off the Olivet, the Mount Olivet, which was just on the other side of that was Bethany, and he had spent the night there in Bethany. We find out it was the night before the Saturday that he was with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and it was there that Mary had broke the oil and poured it on Jesus, and with her hair wiped his feet, and it was there that he was anointed for his burial, Jesus says. What she did was prophetic. It was something that was necessary to happen. And now Jesus wakes up this next morning, and he's making his journey into Jerusalem. Now understand, Jesus at this point is a wanted man. There had already been an all points bulletin put out for him. The Pharisees had already discussed, anyone who sees Jesus, we want you to come and tell us so that we can arrest him. Matter of fact, in John's account, in chapter 11, verse 57, it says this: both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a command that if anyone knew where Jesus was, he should report it, that they might seize him. So everything was already in motion. They had expected Jesus to show up for the Passover. They were waiting for him to come. And Jesus comes just like predicted by the Pharisees. He comes, and now he's on that other side. He's there in the region of Bethany and Bethphage. And what's interesting is that he tells his disciples, "I want you guys to go, and I want you to go and bring a colt that had never been ridden." Now, it's significant because he gives them very clear instructions and what that was to look like. Look, I want you to go, you'll walk right into the city, you'll see the colt sitting there, and when you see it, start to untie it, and I want you to bring it, and if they tell you anything, tell me, hey, the Lord has need of it. Now, we don't know if this was something that was already prearranged. We don't know if this is something that just, by the leading of the Holy Spirit, this kind of took place. All we know is that they find this colt, and this colt had never been ridden before, and they loose this colt, and they begin to bring this colt to Jesus. Now, I think important as well is that pilgrims were coming in from all over the place. Jerusalem had a population, according to Josephus, of about 80,000 people. But during Passover, and in the days leading up to Passover, it would swell upwards to 2 million people. So you imagine, the traffic jam coming into Jerusalem was pretty intense. Josephus tells us that on Passover, during the days of Jesus, there would be 250,000 lambs that would be sacrificed. And there would be a requirement to have at least 10 people per lamb. So it was upward from 2 million people that would have been journeying into Jerusalem. And this cult, as long as, all the crowds are kind of making their way early in the morning. One of the most incredible sights when you make it to Jerusalem is getting on the Mount of Olives, and we start at the top, and you kind of start to wind your way down, and then you get this glimpse, man, about, a quarter of the way down, you get this glimpse, and you see the Temple Mount, and you see the whole city of Jerusalem. And it's breathtaking. You just stand there, and it's just like, man, not only is this scene, kind of surreal and out of a movie or out of a picture, but then you realize that you're in the very pathway that Jesus would have been riding his donkey on. It's interesting that Jesus at this point takes this colt that's brought to him, some clothes are put over that colt, and he's placed upon that colt. Now, what's the significance of riding a colt? Like, what's that all about? Well, it's Matthew tells us, and I think, the Old Testament prophecies, because Matthew's pointing it to the Old Testament prophecies, is that it was one of the indicators, it was one of the signs that the Messiah had come. When they see their Messiah, he would come riding on a colt. It's Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, and it says this: "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation," watch this, "lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey." The foal of a donkey. Now, guys, it was a marker. It was a declaration that the Messiah was there, and Jesus knew he was fulfilling the prophecy, and it appears that many people on that road were aware that he was fulfilling the prophecy. It was the Son of David. Now, what's interesting is when a king is riding a donkey or a colt, what that indicates, it's a time of peace. Think about this. Next time Jesus comes back, he's going to be riding a white horse, not a donkey, because it's going to be a time of war. It's going to become a time of defeat and conquer, right? This time he's riding a donkey because he came in peace, and he's riding a colt, which is and I think also significant. It was King Solomon when David was on the throne, and someone else was one of the other brothers was trying to take the position of king, that David says, "Take my donkey, have Solomon ride on that donkey, and go down to the brook Kidron," which is the very same location that Jesus comes riding in. And it was when they proclaimed Solomon, the son of David, to be king. And this also aligns with the son of David is king, and he's making that proclamation. Incredible. All of the prophecy, being fulfilled at this time. And what's incredible is not only is he claiming to be king and is he claiming to be royalty, the people in the crowd began to cry out and they're singing a psalm and they're declaring Psalm 118 verse 26. And it's a messianic psalm. And they understood that Jesus is declaring to be the Messiah. They start to sing, Hosanna, Hosanna. Save us, save us. And it's amazing because he didn't come to bring wrath or he didn't come to bring war. Notice what that psalm says, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Remember what the angels sang when Jesus was born? Peace. Now we have again the psalm declaring peace. He came to bring peace between man and God. And it was his mission and it was his purpose. He came into this world to bring peace. Matter of fact, Ephesians 2:14 says this, for he himself is our peace, who has made both one and he's broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, to create in himself one new man from the two, thus, check this out, making peace. See, Jesus came to bring peace on earth. And that peace was between us and a holy God. And it's this event that those that were present understood that. Those that were present are aware of it. They're crying out that the Messiah has come, and everyone present, man. I can imagine it was electrifying. The crowds, the worship, the Messiah. Word would get back that someone claimed to be king rather than Caesar. Jesus is going to challenge political rule, but he's also going to challenge the religious rule. The Pharisees are going to be totally upset because of what Jesus is doing and what he's claiming to be. And we see this in this passage. So much so that we find in verse 39, he says, the Pharisees called to Jesus from the crowd, saying, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. Why did the Pharisees, Jesus, you need to rebuke those who are proclaiming that psalm upon you. Why would they be doing that? Because they understood what was happening as well. They understood that Jesus was proclaiming to be the Messiah. And I found it interesting how Jesus responds to their request. Would you just tell your disciples to, that's not true. Tell them that what they're saying isn't valid. Tell them that, not to say and proclaim the things that they're proclaiming about you. And Jesus just turns to them and he says, I tell you that if these should keep silent, the stones would immediately cry out. The stones would sing his praises. It's been noted that would have been the very first rock concert. Oh, I couldn't help it. What's interesting, though, in this passage is every time you see that reference to a stone, it's a reference to someone's heart who's been hardened. He talks over and over about having a stony heart. And it's interesting, in the book of Ezekiel 11:9, I just found this passage. I thought, man, it really kind of that's interesting. Look at Ezekiel 11:19 it is. I will give them one heart. I will put a new spirit within them, and I will take the stony heart out of their flesh, and I'll give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. And that Jesus would turn, he could have said, the very trees would have said it. He could have said, the walls would have spoke out. He didn't say any of that. He says, let me tell you something, the stones would have spoke out. Would have sang out. So even the stones would have acknowledged. And yet the Pharisee with their stony hearts wouldn't acknowledge that what Jesus was proclaiming was truth. And it's quite ironic, because at that moment, and in this very instance, it tells us that Jesus kind of gets to that place where now he's overlooking Jerusalem. And he's overlooking Jerusalem. And I kind of picture, because when you start coming down the Mount of Olives, it's kind of windy, and it's kind of hard to really make a view of the city of Jerusalem until you're about a quarter of the way down. And I can imagine that Jesus starts at the top, and all of the crowds are singing and worshiping, and the Pharisees are trying to squelch the event that's taking place. And then Jesus comes around that corner and he overlooks Jerusalem. And it says that he began to weep over it. There's 2 times that we find in the Bible that Jesus wept. One, the shortest verse in the whole Bible, Jesus wept, right? That's when Lazarus was dead. And the word used is that his eyes kind of welled up. When he realized, how death stings, and when how the cause of death has such an impact upon humanity and upon family and upon loved ones. And it seems as though Jesus at that moment it says he welled up. He knew he was going to go resurrect Lazarus, but at that moment it says he wept. But it was just kind of like his, if you weren't looking intently, if you weren't close enough to see, you'd have never noticed that he was weeping. That's not the word that's used in this passage. The word used in this passage is that Jesus began to weep profusely. It means that it was noticeable that he was crying and weeping over Jerusalem. And what's ironic in this whole passage is that he begins at this point to speak to the city as a whole, to the Jewish people in particular. And what he says to them, he says, if you had known, even you especially, in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. At the very end of that passage, he says, because you did not know the time of your visitation. And what's implied in this whole passage is that the Jews should have known that this was the Messiah. What it implies in this passage is that they had every indicator to know, not just the colt riding in on a donkey. They had passages that told them of the very day that their Messiah would come. In the book of Daniel, chapter 9, one of the most incredible prophecies was given. Daniel had been praying, and the Bible says that the angel Gabriel came, and he began to give Daniel the answer to his prayer. And he tells him, look, let me turn there, man. And it's an amazing chapter. Daniel chapter 9. And in that passage, is a prophecy. Beginning in verse 24. He says, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for the holy city, to finish the transgressions, to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, to seal up visions and prophecies, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command, what command? To restore and to build Jerusalem, until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, or 69 weeks. Watch this. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. They were given the prophecy. There would be a 69-week period. That word week, the picture is weeks of years. Week just it indicates that it's groups of 7. When we think a week of days, that's 7 days. When you think a week of years, it's a 7-year time frame. And what's incredible is that they were told in 62 plus 7, 69 weeks, then the Messiah is going to come. Now, here's what we know. In Nehemiah chapter 2, Nehemiah goes before King Artaxerxes. And he asked if he can go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem because the people were in great distress. And Artaxerxes gives him the command, and it was on March 14th, 445 BC. We know that to the day, according to biblical account. 483 years on a 360-day calendar, which what the Jews would have been going by. It would have been a total of 173,880 days. $173,880 days fell on April 6, 32 AD. The very day that Jesus comes riding in on a donkey. And Jesus says, if you would have just known the day of your visitation, if you would have just known, because I gave you all the indicators, I fulfilled multiple of prophecy, that you would know that this was the day. I think something significant when you look at that whole picture and you realize that prophecy was time sensitive. Guys, if Jesus was not the Messiah, then there is no Messiah. He can't show up in our day and claim someone claiming they're the Messiah because they could never fulfill Daniel chapter 9. Jesus was the only one who could fulfill that prophecy because it was on April 6, 32 AD that prophecy would be fulfilled. And so anyone else afterwards, anyone else on any other day that makes the proclamation that they're Messiah, it wouldn't line up biblically and it wouldn't line up scripturally, and there's no way for them to fulfill the things that Jesus fulfilled. And the only thing you can declare and the only thing you can conclude is that Jesus is the Messiah. And he expected the Pharisees and the scribes to know that. And because they did not know that, he says, destruction, wrath is coming upon this whole city. And it did. 38 years later, 70 AD, Titus and his Roman army would destroy Jerusalem. It's interesting that Jesus weeps And he says this, there in verse 42, it says, if you had known, even you especially in this your day, the things that make for what? Your peace. Interesting. Jesus came to make peace. And they missed it. Because their hearts had become so hardened concerning the things of God, concerning the truth that God declares. You see, we begin Holy Week. We begin this Passion Week. And it should remind us, guys, that God has our peace at mind. That's what led to the cross. Because it was the payment for sin that made peace between us and God. And you can deny it. You can reject it. But there's no one else that would ever fulfill that prophecy. It's not even possible. It was that day that was foretold. And so if Jesus is not the Messiah, then there is no Messiah coming. And if Jesus is not the Son of God, then we're all left to our own demise. And yet, over and over again, he proves that he is the Son of God. Over 500 prophecies fulfilled at his birth, life, and death. Here on this Palm Sunday, he fulfills multiple prophecies. Some of them from Isaiah's account, some of them from Daniel's account, from Nehemiah, who when the account was given to go rebuild the wall. And it's interesting that it was to go rebuild the city and the walls. See, some of the Jews today, they want to go and say, well, that was when Ezra was given the command to go and rebuild the temple. But that's not what the prophecy is all about. The prophecy is talking about the walls and the city being rebuilt, not the temple being rebuilt. Interesting. It couldn't be Ezra that where we start the countdown to 483 years. It has to be Nehemiah's command to go and rebuild the walls, because the detail in Daniel was concerning the city and the wall, not the temple. Interesting. It's undeniable. It's incredible. To the very day that the Messiah would come, foretold. It also tells us there in verse 42, but now they're hidden from your eyes. They were blind. Jesus called them, the Pharisees, the blind leading the blind. They were blind because they would not open their heart to truth. God gave us a reasonable faith. He's not asking us to have a blind faith. I think we have a reasonable faith. You look at all the prophecy and fulfilled, you come to the conclusion, man, this cannot be a coincidence. It can't be a chance. It's because there wasn't no accident. There's too many things that had to happen and did happen in order for what Jesus, to fulfill, in order, for him to make that claim. It just can't be a chance. I think it's unreasonable for you to look at all of that evidence and go, well, that maybe, that was just an accident. That's unreasonable. We have a reasonable faith. But this has nothing to do with the facts. It has to do with your heart. And I think what's significant is that you and I are living in very interesting times. Because some 2,000 years ago, a Messiah came and he promised that he was coming back a second time. He promised that he would go and make a house for us, that where he is, we can be with him also. He promised that he was going to come and judge the world for their rebellion. And I'll tell you, watching the events that are happening in our world, I can't believe how fast, things were able to turn. It's almost mind-boggling how fast we went from being so free to giving up so many of our rights because of a virus. I'm not saying we enter the tribulation period, but I do think we just had a dress rehearsal. I really think that things have been set up and set into play like never before. If you've been watching the news, you've been looking at these things. Part of that stimulus package, what they were attempting to sneak into that stimulus package was what they're calling a digital dollar, which would have led us into a cashless society. I don't think it's an accident. They were also, the UK Prime Minister Brown, I believe, was saying what we need to do in order to fight this virus, we got to form a one world government. Guys, these things are being floated out there. A cashless society and a one world government. Now, I'm not some kind of extremist in those views, but you're hearing these things talked about like they're normal. Like it's acceptable, and you just kind of go, wait a second, I read about that before. I've kind of seen that in my Bible. And it should cause all of us, we're entering into Holy Week, but we're in Holy Week in a great time of panic and fear throughout our whole nation and the whole world. I think it would do us some good to sit back and say, wait a second, man, maybe all those claims that Jesus made and expecting his disciples to know, or expecting the nation of Israel to know that he was coming, I wonder what it's going to be like when he comes back the second time. Is he expecting us to know? Did he give us enough signs and enough warning that you and I would kind of go, wait a second, it sounds like we're ready for his second coming? Just a few chapters down, if you would. Just a few chapters down. Look at chapter 21. Luke's gospel still. Look at verse 28. Remember, this is within that Passion Week. I mean, Jesus knows that the cross is at this point just days away. It's there in verse 28. He says, now when you see these things happen, look up, lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. And he spoke to them a parable. He said, look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they're already budding, you see and know for yourselves that summer is now near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of God is near. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But take heed to yourselves, lest your heart be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the cares of this life, and that day come upon you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare. Watch this. It will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Wow. When you start to see these things happen, look up. And it's going to come in an unexpected way. It's going to be a snare. It's going to be a trap. Remember, the Pharisees thought they were trapping Jesus, and Jesus was trapping them. He started the ball into motion that would lead to his arrest, trial, death, and resurrection. And he said, it's going to come like a snare upon the whole earth. And then, watch this, watch therefore and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and stand before the Son of Man. Guys, I'm not claiming that Jesus is coming back next week or next month or next year or 5 years. I have no idea, but I know this. I'm watching. Because there's too many things that are saying this seems a little eerie. This seems a little weird. And it reflects so many of the things of biblical prophecy. And things, this week, Idaho, earthquake, 5.7, I believe it was. No, it wasn't Portales, it was Carlsbad, New Mexico, 5.5 earthquake. You're just going, wait, I never heard of a 5-point earthquake in New Mexico. What's up with that? Idaho? Earthquakes in various places? I remember reading that before. There just seems to be too many things that you're just kind of going on. Now, again, we could be another 50 years. I'm not trying to put a date on it. I'm just telling you, there's a lot of things in play right now. And then, I think the admonition is what? Watch. Watch. Be ready. The whole city of Jerusalem missed the first coming. Think about it. They missed it. And Jesus weeps over them, and then he says in that passage, he says, look, going back to chapter 19, he says, because you did not know the time of your visitation. And what was it going to the result is that they were going to be in the middle of all of the wrath that would come upon the city of Jerusalem. I don't believe God's appointed the church to wrath. I believe we're going to get out of here. But we need to be watching. And as we reflect upon all of these events, as we look at all of these things, I pray for all of us it would be a time when we just press into the Lord.